Learn how SQL Server 2022 is a cloud-connected database this week on Data Exposed. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed. Today, I'm joined once again by Bob Ward. Bob, thanks so much for joining us again today.
Anna, excited always to be on your show, and certainly excited to talk about this topic, SQL Server.
Exactly. Yeah. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion on SQL Server 2022. If you haven't seen the first episode in this series, I encourage you to go watch it. We'll put a link to it in the description. But Bob, we're going to be continuing our discussion. We've seen an overview of SQL Server 2022. I'm so excited to dive into some of these details. What are we going to be talking about today?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. In the first episode, we really just tried to give you kind of a broad overview of what we're trying to do with this release with SQL Server 2022. What I thought it makes sense today is dive a little bit deeper into this first area that I called Cloud Connected or Azure Enabled. So I'd like to explain over the next few minutes, what do we mean by that? Why would you do that? And what are some of the scenarios we're trying to solve for our customers with connecting SQL Server to the cloud?
Awesome. That sounds great. Let's get right into it.
Let's do it. I just want to remind everybody, though, kind of the overarching thing we're doing with SQL Server 2022. The first three areas are really what we're going to focus on today, and that is connecting your SQL Server with services like Managed Instance for disaster recovery, or analytics with Synapse, or Purview for security. But don't forget, and you're going to see this in future episodes in Data Exposed and other things that we'll be talking about this release, that we continue to make big investments into security, performance, and availability for SQL Server, and the fact that SQL Server 2022 continues on this journey of this consistency of edge to the cloud, whether it be our engine, our tools, or languages. But let's kind of talk specifically about these three areas: Managed Instance, Synapse, and Purview. So first of all, today, Anna, somebody can actually set up a disaster recovery site in their own data center with SQL Server. They can use things like distributed availability groups. They can even do that in Azure. But it's a lot of time and effort and configuration to make that work. Plus, the disaster recovery site, they have to do all the management of that. Wouldn't it be cool if you could actually link your SQL Server to Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is a platform as a service? So what we would like to be able to show customers to do is that now you can easily take SQL Server through tools like Management Studio, point them to a deployed Azure SQL Managed Instance, and say, I'd like to attach my SQL Server to that, like to seed my database, like an availability group. But I'd like to make this like a distributed availability group to Managed Instance. But can you do all the work for me? Can you just make all this configured for me? Wouldn't that be nice? And so that's what we're trying to do in the background. And then, of course, you can optionally use that Managed Instance for read scale purposes. But here's the cool thing, Anna, and this is probably going to blow your mind. You could take a backup from Azure SQL Managed Instance and for the first time restore that back to SQL Server. If you look at the diagram here, it really is disaster recovery in the cloud, which you could actually set up an online failover. Let's say you had a problem with your SQL Server. You could say, hey, I'd like to fail this over to Managed Instance because you've been updating that for me. And now I've got platform as a service behind the scenes and the complete Azure infrastructure powering everything I need. I can start using that as my primary. And then when I'm ready, I actually could move back to my SQL Server. Or in the interim, I could take a backup of Managed Instance database and restore it to a SQL Server to look at things temporarily while my Managed Instance is acting as my primary. So I'm really excited to set up this for customers and see this in action, because it's going to make disaster recovery a lot easier for them.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is amazing. It is kind of blowing my mind. I feel like this is one of those things that would be awesome to see it, to believe it. Is there something you can show us today, Bob?
What do you want, like a demo on your show? I think we can do that. I think we can do a demo. So here's something that we've recorded that kind of shows the experience. And let's just kind of unpack it as we're going through this. And we record these same things sometimes, Anna, because it's time lapse, because it could take a while to show everything. But here's a SQL Server I'm connected to, and I've got the Wide World Importers database. You can see I'm showing my server name, which is a local server name. I'm showing its read write, that's my primary, and I'm showing some data. It's like an email campaign we're adding to Wide World Importers. What I'm going to use now is a wizard to attach myself to Managed Instance. Now, I've already done that process here, and if through that process, I point my Azure subscription, here's my target at Managed Instance I want to go to, and we see that database. Look what happened behind the scenes. When we attach this, we automatically configure an availability group and a distributed availability group for you behind the scenes and connect that to managed instance. You can see you're in managed instance. This is what I've already deployed. I've deployed a business critical tier managed instance, which, by the way, has its own availability group behind the scenes. And I've told SQL Server, connect to that and just start taking changes to that. And you can see here in Management Studio, I've got the same database. In fact, one cool way is to look at queries side by side. On the left is the query to SQL Server, right? And on the right is the query to managed instance. You can see it's read-only, because I've set it up as my replica automatically. It's got the same set of email addresses for my campaign on both systems. What if I made a change? So I'm gonna make a change to the local SQL Server, and because I've set this up as a DR site, I should be able to go into the managed instance, as you can see in a comparison, and see both rows. Automatic changes have taken place. Things are incrementally changing for me because it is my disaster recovery site. Well, that's pretty cool to see how that actually works. But what if I wanted to fail over? What if I had a problem on my main system? I could hit this migrate section. And by the way, some of these screens may change as we're building and working through the release. But here what I'm going to do, I'm going to sign as Anna Hoffman. I like using your account all the time, Anna. I'm going to sign as Anna Hoffman, and I'm actually going to go into my managed instance and say, that's what I'd like to fail over to. And I'd like to do something called a planned failover, where the last few changes are going to get synchronized. I'm going to quiesce my workload, say I want to do a planned failover. And just like you would do in a distributed availability group, we're going to go ahead and fail over to that managed instance. Now, behind the scenes, because I said planned, we're going to make sure data gets synchronized, the last few changes, and then we're going to let SQL Server connected to managed instance make it work. Now, I think what I'd like to do is insert data into that new primary and see if it exists. Can you see now here that the managed instance is read-write and that new row shows up? That's pretty cool. Now, we did say it would be kind of nice to take a backup of managed instance and restore it to SQL Server. Customers have asked for a while, can I do something like that? Is it possible that I could back up my managed instance and restore it to SQL Server? Well, there's a copy-only backup feature in managed instance. So I can take this database with that change. I can back it up. Then what I'd like to do maybe is take that backup in the cloud, go to my local SQL Server. It could be a different SQL Server, right, that I'm using, and restore that backup into the local SQL Server. I'll use a different name here to avoid confusion with the original database I had. I'm pointing to Azure Blob Storage where the database exists. I restore it. And what I expect to see is that new row show up. Remember, I inserted a new row in my email campaign when managed instance was my primary. So let's go take a look and see what that looks like in the local SQL Server. This is the local SQL Server. I'm going to run a query. It is that new backup. And sure enough, there is that row showing up. So for the first time, Anna, we're restoring from managed instance back to a SQL Server. That is going to be a sticker shock for many people.
Yeah, wow. I mean, this is just amazing. And what I also love is that, we're able to use T-SQL for a lot of this. We're able to use SSMS, the tools we already know how to use, and it's really easy to set up, and it kind of goes full circle. So thanks so much for showing us this. I know there's other stuff. I feel greedy asking for more after seeing this, but what else is there?
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I think that's going to be a powerful feature for a lot of people that are struggling to set up disaster recovery or maintaining it, and we're going to make it a lot easier to do that. So think of this scenario, Anna. Today, you've got operational data in your SQL Server environment. I say operational, you're always changing it, like OLTP type things, right? But you always do an analytics on that. And there's all sorts of solutions people have built to do this. But Synapse, Azure Synapse Analytics is becoming a very popular way and method to do analytics in the cloud. So I might like to do analytics. And if you see right here, let me kind of back up just for a second here. I might want to take my SQL Server and use Azure Synapse Analytics with ETL. I mean, that's just, it's usually daily. It's hard to build. It's hard to refresh. It's like a copy process, right? So I could do this. I could take my SQL pools in my warehouse for analytics and take SQL Server data and just refresh it on a daily basis. And I could do Power BI on top of that. But wouldn't it be neat if I could do this? What if I could change this to go into SQL Server and say, hey, here's some tables in my database. I want you, SQL Server, to monitor changes from the transaction log, like change feeds. Take those and incrementally populate that into my warehouse. And now my Power BI reports can just be refreshed, and I can see almost near real time of data. So I've offloaded my analytics. I've reduced the need for ETL, and I'm using the power of Synapse. And of course, Anna, a lot of people talk about Synapse and they're like, what else can it do for me? Remember that it supports doing things in Azure Data Lake for unstructured or semi-structured storage. So now you could join that data together or even take advantage of things like Spark or Azure Machine Learning to do machine learning on top of this data that you just fed in from SQL Server, and then the great integration of Power BI on top of that. So think about now having SQL Server as another source of data for your Synapse workspace, but in a much easier way set up to just feed changes into Synapse. So very excited to see this happen. A lot of people are struggling to figure out how they integrate these worlds together, and we're going to make that link happen in a very seamless fashion. And quite frankly, continue on the path of you've seen from other link announcements for Synapse, Cosmos DB, Dataverse, and those kind of type things. Now, one other area we talked about was Purview. Purview, exciting new technology for Azure that we've recently announced. And think about capturing things from your data estate, things like the scheme of my tables, classification data for my tables. And I want to do that across a ton of assets in my enterprise, both in the cloud and on premises. With SQL Server, we're going to integrate with Azure Purview in a way that's going to make that simple for you to do. And then even take it a step further, because Purview can be a governance mechanism for you to set up authorization and access to resources. So imagine a world where you can set up a central authorization scheme to decide who are my performance monitor people in my organization. And I want to have a central way and a consistent way of setting that up across different assets. So I want to further that least privilege concept, but I don't have to like do it myself across all these things like SQL Server. Can't Purview just handle that and push those things down to SQL and tell it, hey, when somebody logs in, this is the authorization I've set up in Purview. You just work with that in my organization. So managed instance disaster recovery, Synapse Link for analytics, and Purview for security and governance. 3 big areas we're working on. So there's probably a few other things you want to know about. So I had to throw these things in because these are things that people have asked us for about connecting further with the cloud, and that is Azure Active Directory authentication. Think of this scenario today. You want to go into SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine, but you want to use that Windows authentication mechanism, but you don't want to set up a domain controller. Now you can just use Azure AD directly from a SQL Server. It could be on premises or it could be an Azure Virtual Machine. Excited to see that one land because several customers have said to us, this is really important to us because guess what? They're centralizing authentication in Azure Active Directory. You know, Azure Defender has been a popular technology, now branded Microsoft Defender for SQL. And we are going to make sure that we continue down this path of making sure SQL Server is part of this so you can be proactive about what you're doing for vulnerability assessments, to look at things like injection attacks or attacks on your database, injection alerts on your system. So you want to use this across your SQL data estate. We talked about Azure SQL Edge to Cloud. SQL Server 2022 will also be part of that story with Microsoft Defender. That's a pretty good look, Anna. I think what we have in terms of making SQL Server a cloud-connected database, disaster recovery, analytics, security, authentication, and Defender. Excited to see how this is going to really help customers make their life easier and do things in more new and efficient ways with the cloud.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, this has just been amazing, and it's cool to see the Azure connectivity and Azure enabled side of this version of SQL Server. It's kind of almost introducing like this new version of hybrid. So I'm excited to see opportunities that this opens for our customers as well. You know, for people who are just so excited like I am and want to get hands-on, can you remind us how we can kind of get started with SQL Server 2022?
Absolutely. We got a couple links for you here to look at on the screen. We'll post those as well for you. Use this first one to get more information just about the release itself. You know, we're starting out, as we do with any SQL Server release, in a preview fashion. So if you want to sign up and start using these technologies and working directly with us in engineering, the second is a link to get into our early adopter program. And then finally, Microsoft Mechanics. This is a way for you to look at from the mechanics point of view world. Let me see and learn further and deeper about SQL Server 2022. So, Anna, you know, SQL Server is my jam, and I'm super excited that SQL Server 2022 has been announced, and I look forward as we move towards finally launching this in calendar year 2022 to see how customers react to this, how they use it, and just to keep the message of SQL Server going. Pretty excited to see it happen.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Bob, for coming on the show and sharing all this with us. It's been really exciting. To our viewers, we'll have all those links in the description as well as a link to this playlist so you can follow along. The SQL Server 2022 series is the second episode. There will be more to come, so you'll definitely want to follow along with that. Be sure to like this video, leave us a comment, and let us know what you think of the Azure Connected capabilities in SQL Server 2022. And we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.